Alright, hi there, students. So today we are going to learn chapter 7, which is the risk management, treating risk. In chapter 6, you have learned about the risk management, assessing the risk. Alright, then after we have we go through on how to assess uh, the vulnerability of each of these information assets. So now, and then the impact that the each of the risks can bring to the organization. So we are going to learn on how to treat the risk. The learning objective for this chapter is number one, discuss the strategy options used to treat the risk and be prepared to select from them when given background information. And then evaluate control alternatives under the defense risk treatment strategy and formulate a cost-benefit analysis using existing conceptual framework. Number three, explain how to maintain and perpetuate controls. And number four, describe popular methodologies used in the industry to manage all of these risks. In order to function effectively, any organization must design and create a secure environment in which business process and procedures can function effectively. Therefore, the system must maintain confidentiality and privacy and assure that the integrity and availability of the data in the database. So this is where the risk treatment, the risk management is applied. After the risk management process, team has identified, analyzed, and evaluated the level of risk currently inherent in its information asset, then the risk must be treated. Any risk that is deemed unacceptable and when it exceeds the risk appetite. Risk appetite means the statement of how much you are willing to accept if any of these risks, if any of the threat happens. Treating risk begins with an understanding of what risk treatment strategies are and how to formulate them. So the risk management process, the risk treatment, the process preparation of the risk management, and then need to assess the risk. The one has been done in chapter 6, and then analyze the threat of the risk, what is the impact factor of the risk, and then evaluate how much the company will lose if the risk is not contained. And then depending on the evaluation, whether it has a low impact or high impact, and then the risk treatment will be determined on how to contain the risk, the threat. After we have treated the risk, then monitor and review, and then begin with the process again. There are 5 risk treatment strategies. Number 1, defense. Number 2, transference. Number 3, mitigation. Number 4, acceptance. And then number 5, termination. Defense risk treatment strategy attempts to prevent the exploitation of the vulnerability. This is the preferred approach and accomplished by means of countering threats, removing vulnerabilities in assets, limiting access to assets, and adding protective safeguards. This approach is sometimes referred to as avoidance. All right, so any organization can use antivirus for defense strategy, antivirus, firewall network. The one is countering threats, removing vulnerabilities asset. So identify all of the assets, whether it can be exploited or not. If it can be exploited, therefore you have to remove the the characteristics of the asset that has vulnerabilities that can be exploited. And then limiting access to assets. So PNC data need to be accessed by only certain position, not allowing uh, any end user to access it, or use biometric, or use password, and then add protective safeguard. For example, use encryption key, or provide staff, personnel, security staff. The common methods of risk defense is number one, application of policy. The instructions, the mandate must come from the top that, that offer the guidelines on how to treat the threats. This one lah, remove vulnerabilities, assets, and so on. And then application of security environment training awareness program. Okay, this one is you create training awareness program on cyber security for all of the employees, and then implementation of technology. We use biometric, or firewalls, or the antivirus, any kind of technology that can prevent the exploitation of vulnerability. Transference risk treatment strategy attempts to shift risk to another entity. It can be accomplished by rethinking how services are offered, redevising deployment models, outsourcing to another organizations, purchasing insurance, or implementing service contracts with providers. This risk treatment strategy, transference, is preferable when the company or the organization does not have any expert in cybersecurity or security management. Service level agreement is the only guarantee that external organization will implement the level of security in the client or organization wants. So this level agreement is the agreement that you and the IT consultant will have in order to do the risk treatment strategy for you. So it will state the objective of the SLA, what do you want the IT consultant for you, and then define requirements, what the IT consultant want for the client to prepare for them in order for them to effectively do the risk treatment strategy for you. And then setting measurements, how it will be achieved, how to measure whether there's no vulnerabilities or there's no threats coming in, and then establish accountability, who is responsible for that system once the service level agreement is commenced, or who is the key person who is taking care of the project. Mitigation risk treatment strategy. The term mitigation is contain, membendung. It is the treatment approach that focuses on planning and preparation to reduce the impact or potential consequences of an incident or disaster. This approach includes four types of plans. Number one, a disaster recovery plan. Number two, response plan, business continuity plan, and crisis management plan. Um, any attack happens, these plans will be carried out. Any of these plans according to the policy. This is the summary of mitigation plan, incident response plan. It is the actions that will be taken during incidents. For example, list the steps to be taken during incident, intelligence gathering, and information analysis. When it should be deployed uh, as the incident or disaster unfolds, as soon as the incident happens. And then the time frame is to contain the real-time problem and the real-time reaction. Disaster recovery plan, the preparations for recovery should disaster occur, strategies to limit losses before and during disaster, and step-by-step instructions to regain back to normal again. For example, procedures for recovery of lost data, procedures for re-establishment of lost technology infrastructure, and shutdown procedures to protect systems and data. It should be deployed immediately after the incident is labeled as disaster. This is a disaster recovery plan, normally for short-term recovery. Business continuity plan are the steps to ensure the continuation of overall business when the scale of a disaster exceeds, and the disaster recovery plan ability to quickly restore the operations. For example, the preparation steps for activation of alternate data centers, establishment of critical business functions in alternate location. For example, there's a fire, therefore you have to have a backup center. Establish a temporary center so that your business can continue to operate temporarily. When it is deployed, immediately after disaster is determined to affect the continued operations of the organization, and this is more on long-term organizational stability. Crisis management plan are the steps to ensure the safety and welfare of the people associated with the organization in the event of an incident. So this is more on the people. For example, the procedures for notification of personnel in the event of incident disaster, procedures for communication with emergency services, and procedures for reacting to and recovering from personnel safety threats. Deployed immediately when incident or disaster is deemed to threaten personnel safety. This tackles both short-term and safety and long-term personnel welfare stability. That one is a mitigation. So the fourth one is acceptance risk treatment strategy. This is the decision to do nothing beyond the current level of protection and to accept the outcome from any resulting exploitation. Maybe the risk is not does not affect the company so much, therefore the company is accept the risk, do nothing. However, this strategy can only be taken only if the alternatives and the cost of protecting an asset does not justify the security expenditure. If it's not worth to protect, therefore they will do nothing. Or the impact is not so bad, maybe a little. So do do nothing from uh, to treat the risk. However, you need to determine all of this first before you want to pursue with acceptance risk treatment strategy. Number one, determine the level of risk. If it is too small, therefore can choose acceptance risk treatment strategy. And then assess the probability of attack and the likelihood of a successful exploitation of vulnerability. Estimated the potential impact that could result from successful attack. Evaluate potential controls using each appropriate type of feasibility. Perform a thorough risk assessment, including CBA, cost benefit analysis, and determine that the cost to treat the risk to a particular function, service, collection of data, and information asset does not justify the cost of implementing and maintaining the controls. If all of these have been considered, and then it was determined that the impact is not that great, therefore acceptance is a valid strategy for that case. And then termination. Termination is strategy is based on the organization's intentional choice not to protect an asset. However, the organization does not wish the information asset to remain at risk, so removes it from the environment that represents the risk. Sometimes it is not worth to protect, or the cost of maintaining it uh, is higher than keeping it. Therefore, the asset is totally removed. So we go to managing risk. What is risk appetite? It is the quantity and nature of risk that organizations are willing to accept as they evaluate the trade-offs between perfect security and unlimited accessibility. When vulnerabilities have been controlled to the degree of possible, there is a remaining risk that has not been completely removed or plans, or in other words, residual risks. Residual risks are the risks that uh, still there after all of the controls or all the risk treatment strategy have been deployed. So after all these controls have been implemented, still there is some risk, therefore it is considered as residual risk. So how the risk handling action points? Number one, asset assessment. Is it vulnerable? If it's not vulnerable, then there is no risk. If it is vulnerable, then we move on to the second question. Is it can be exploited? If it cannot be exploited, no risk. If it is exploitable, the asset is vulnerable to attack, and then it is confirmed that threat and vulnerability exist. Therefore, uh, here we determine what are the threat source. Is it come from hacking, or is it come from the virus or anonymous attack? And then we go to the risk of loss exists. Is the attacker's gain greater than cost of attack? If it's not, the risk can be accepted. If the attackers gain greater than the cost of attack, then move on to the next question. Is the expected loss greater than the organization's ability to absorb? Then we go for risk acceptance. If it's not, we can determine this is unacceptable risk. Therefore, require further treatment via defense strategy or transference strategy or mitigated, or last but not least, the asset must be terminated. Rules of thumb for selecting strategy. They implement security controls to reduce the likelihood of vulnerability being exploited. Okay, number one, when a vulnerability exists in an important assets. And then when the vulnerability can be exploited. After applied layer protection, architectural and administrative controls to minimize the risk or prevent the occurrence of an attack. Number three, when the attacker's potential gain is greater than the cost of attack. So what to do? Apply protections to increase the cost of attacker. So apply firewall, apply any protection to make the attacker more difficult to gain control to the system. When the potential loss is substantial, when the potential loss can cripple the system, or when the potential loss can is very costly or is very too big, the damage, and therefore you need to apply design principle, architectural design, and technical and non-technical protections to limit the extent of attack. Once a treatment strategy has been selected and implemented, control should be monitored and measured on an ongoing basis to determine the effectiveness and to maintain an ongoing estimate of the remaining risk. Each information TVA, threat vulnerability asset, that was developed in the risk assessment created previously should have documented treatment strategy that clearly identifies any residual risk that remains after the proposed strategy has been executed. And these are the software that help any organization to do the risk assessment and risk treatment strategy. Before deciding on the strategy for specific threat vulnerability, what is that? Asset, the organization should explore any readily accessible information about the economic and non-economic consequences of exploitation of the vulnerability. When the threat causes a loss to the asset, what are the actual and perceived advantages of implementing a control as opposed to the actual and perceived disadvantages? Is the cost of protecting it worth it? Worth keeping? Cost avoidance is the money saved by using the defense strategy via the implementation of control, thus eliminating the financial ramification of incident. So what are costs? Some items that affect the cost of control or safeguard. Number one is the cost of development and acquisition. The training fees on using the system or using the software. Cost of implementing the system. Service costs. If you buy the asset from the supplier. Okay, they need to service you. Therefore, this is considered as service cost. Cost of maintenance, doing the backup, doing the maintenance of the equipment, the asset, all of these costs. And then the potential cost of the loss of the asset. Benefit is the value of the organization using controls to prevent losses associated with specific vulnerability. The benefit usually determined by valuing the information assets or asset exposed by the vulnerability and then determining how much of that value is at risk and how much risk there is for the asset. This is expressed as the annualized loss expectancy, ALE. Asset valuation, uh, it is the process of assigning financial value or worth of each information asset. Asset valuation involves the estimation of real and perceived costs, which can be selected from those design, development, installation, maintenance, protection, recovery, defense against loss or litigation. Asset in terms of data or the system, and then also the physical equipment. Some of the components of asset valuation include value retained from the cost of creating the information asset. For example, uh, many organizations have developed extensive cost accounting practices to capture the costs associated with collecting and processing data, as well as the cost of developing and maintaining software. Software development include the efforts of the many people involved in creating the system. In today's marketplace, with higher programmer salary and even high contractor expenses, the average cost to complete even a moderately sized software application can quickly escalate. For example, multimedia-based training software. Multimedia-based training software that requires 350 hours of development will require the expenditure as much of $10,000 or per hour of content produced. Number two, value retained from past maintenance of the information asset. It is estimated between 60% or 80% of the total cost of acquiring and operating information asset incurred in this maintenance phase. That typically means for every dollar spent on developing an application or acquiring and processing data, another $4 to $5 will be spent after the software is in use. This cost can be estimated in terms of human resources required to continually update, support, modify, and service the application. Number three, the value implied by the cost of replacing the information. This is the cost associated with replacing the information. It includes human and technical resources needed to construct, restore, or regenerate the information from backups, independent transaction logs, or even hard copies. Value from providing the information. This is the cost of providing information to users who need it. These also include the cost of infrastructure necessary to provide access and to control the information. So this is basically the salary of the IT programmer that modify something in the system to give access to the user. Value acquired from the cost of protecting the information, uh, the the protection, the system technology used to protect the information. These are the costs. And then value to owners, how much the system or the asset is valuable to the organization. Value of intellectual properties. Any organization can put value of any IP that they have registered, or any patent, any trademarks, any copyright, and also any uh, intellectual properties. The guidelines, the SOP, and then the structural knowledge of the organization. Value to adversaries. This means how much is it worth of to organization to know what the competition is doing. This can be the research cost, because they want to know how is the competitor doing. Is it better than them? So they have to pay third parties, or they have to ask their staff to find out for them, to carry out research. All of these are costs and evaluation, value to the organization. Loss of productivity while the information assets are unavailable. Loss of revenue when information assets are unavailable. Can you imagine if internet is not working? Can you imagine how much the stock trading will uh, will incur loss, or the banks are not able to operate, or the plants, the kilang-kilang are not able to produce if there are no electricity, or if there are no internet. And then total cost of ownership. This is the sum total of elements of the previous categories, encompassing all expenses associated of buying, acquiring, operating, and disposing of the asset. A traditional model of calculating quantitative cost-benefit analysis involves estimating the likelihood of attack based on annualized rate of occurrence and the impact of an attack based on loss expectancy. What damage could occur and what financial impact would it have? What would it cost to recover from the attack, and in addition to financial impact of damage? And what is the single loss expectancy for each risk? What is SLE? Is the calculated value associated with the most likely loss from single occurrence of specific attack. It takes into account both the value of the asset and the expected percentage of loss that would occur from a particular attack. Okay, for each of any of uh, attack, okay, so SLE will calculate one attack equals to how much single loss expectancy. So how to calculate SLE? Asset value times the exposure factor, where exposure factor is the percentage loss that would occur from a given vulnerability being exploited. This information is usually an estimation. Okay, SLE, I repeat, SLE is when is calculated value single loss, if any, uh, if any specific attack happen, what would be the loss? Okay, single loss expectancy. So the calculation is asset value times the exposure factor. For example, the system. One system equals to 10,000. So times how much factor? Maybe disaster, maybe natural disaster, fire, and then internet shutdown, that is 2, and then uh, virus 3. Okay, for example lah, 3 sahaja exposure factor. So 10,000 times 3 tadi, so 30,000 single loss expectancy. Sekali the asset kena attack, dia akan rugi 30,000 contohlah. Usually, the probability of threat occurring is depicted as a table that indicates how frequently an attack from each threat type is likely to occur within a given time frame. This value is commonly referred to as the annualized rate of occurrence, arrow. Arrow simply indicates how often you expect a specific type attack to occur. Let's say natural disaster, how many? Fire lagi, lightning lagi, flood. Okay, so disaster, natural disaster pun ada banyak type. And then apa lagi? Vandalism, sabotage, okay, virus, all of these are each of the type. Once you determine the loss from a single attack, yang SLE tadi, and then the likely frequency of successful attack, you can calculate the overall loss potential per risk, expressed as ALE using the previous value for arrow and SLE. So arrow ni berapa kali kebarangkalian setiap kali, kebarangkalian of each of the type of the attack yang berlaku darab dengan how much is the kerugian if one attack happen. So arrow darab SLE becomes annualized loss expectancy. The CBA determines whether the benefit from a control alternatives is worth the associated cost of implementing and maintaining the control. A CBA may be performed before implementing a control, or they can be performed after controls have been in place. Lepas dah implement control baru kira CBA, ataupun lepas sudah implement all the controls baru kira the CBA. So CBA annualized loss expectancy sebelum all the control methods undertaken minus the annual loss expectancy after all this control minus annualized controls of the safeguard. Another methods of establishing feasibility, organizational feasibility analysis examines how well the proposed information security alternatives will contribute to efficiency, effectiveness, and overall operation of organization. For operational feasibility is the user acceptance support, management acceptance and support, and system compatibility with the requirements of organization stakeholders. User engagement and support can be achieved by through communication, education, and involvement. Technical feasibility determines whether the organization has the capability to acquire the technology, has the expertise to implement, support, and manage the new safeguards. For political feasibility, it determines what can and cannot occur based on the consensus and relationships between the communities of interest. Alternative to feasibility analysis, uh, benchmarking. It is the comparison of organizational effectiveness, productivity against established measure. It can be done internally or externally. Benchmarking means you seek out and studying the practices used in other organizations, and then you evaluate whether it can be implemented in within your organization. Due care and due diligence describe an organization actions when it adopts a certain minimum level of security. Best business practices considered those thought to be among the best in the industry, balancing the need to access information with adequate protection. Gold standard is uh, which the best business practice are not sufficient. They aspire to set the standards for the industry and thus said to be in pursuit of the gold standard. Government recommendation and best practices. These are useful for organizations that operate in industries regulated by the government agencies. For example, engineering, science. All right. Recommended alternative risk treatment practices. This one is other than the five uh, strategy mitigation. These are the other risk treatment practices. Why all of this has be alternative? Because not only the calculation of ALE, SLE, and RO, they are too complicated. Organizations typically look for more straightforward method for implementing controls. This preference has prompted an ongoing search for ways to design security architectures that go beyond the direct application of specific controls for specific information asset vulnerability. In some cases, organizations may not be unable to determine the values. Many of the asset valuation, we do not know how to determine those values. Therefore, we use qualitative and hybrid asset valuation measure. Risk assessment steps can be executed using estimates based on qualitative assessment. This tries to reduce some of the ambiguity of qualitative measures without resulting to the unsubstantiated estimation used for quantitative measure. So we use qualitative data, means we interview from people, and then we use quantitative measure. Quantitative measure means we look at the documents, we look at the uh, costing. Okay, therefore, uh, we use both qualitative and hybrid asset valuation measure. Delphi Technique. It is a process whereby a group rates or ranks a set of information, which is the most important, which is the least important. The individual responses are compiled and then returned to the group for another iteration. Individual response compiled, and then another group, another member in the group will do the evaluation again. This process continues until the entire group is satisfied with the result. This technique can be applied to the development of scales, asset valuation, asset or threat ranking. Delphi Technique pun boleh juga assess threat using the ranking system or any scenario that can benefit from the input of more than one decision maker. Delphi Technique ni beramai-ramai rank the set of information or the threat. Okay, bila ramai sangat rank this threat is high impact, so therefore they will try to put emphasis on that threat because ramai yang vote kan. Alternative risk management methodology, we have this octave method. Operationally critical threat, asset and vulnerability evaluation method. It defines essential components of comprehensive, systematic, and context-driven self-directed information security risk evaluation. Okay, then based on confidentiality, integrity, and availability of critical information technology asset. So how do they do this? Number one, the ID senior management knowledge. Phase one, build asset best threat profiles. Okay, identification, senior management knowledge, and then ID of area management knowledge, and then ID staff knowledge, and create profile, threat profiles. So these people will identify each of the threats based on their knowledge, their area of management, and then their expertise. And then they will give the likelihood of the threat will occur or the vulnerabilities. Phase 2, ID infrastructure vulnerabilities. Okay, they will, after they have created the threat profiles, they will create key components. The key components of the threat, apa yang mungkin menyumbang kepada the vulnerability. And then evaluate selected components. And then phase 3, lepas dah pecah-pecahkan what are the threats, what the sumber of the vulnerabilities, they will develop security and strategy plans, conduct risk analysis, and develop protection strategy. Okay, this one is tak penting. Okay, Microsoft risk management approach. Okay, there are 4 phases in Microsoft Infosecurity risk management process. Number 1, assessing the risk. Number 2, conducting decision support. Number 3, implementing controls. And number 4, program effectiveness. So number 1 tadi, assessing the risk here. What they need to do, apa yang Microsoft ni cadangkan, gather the plain data, gather the risk data, calculation of LE, apa semua tu dalam sini lah. Tapi they are not technical as the LE, RO, SLE tu. Okay, and then they prioritize risk. Mana satu yang lebih bahaya. Okay, and then they conduct decision support, define functional requirements, apa technicality yang diperlukan, the possible control solutions, adakah perlu software ini, software itu, review the solution, adakah murah, adakah mahal, estimate the risk reduction, adakah dapat kurangkan the risk of how many percent, and then adakah mahal, solution cost. And then select mitigation strategy. Then implement the control. Seek holistic approach by asking everyone. Okay, ataupun yes, you ask everyone lah whether this approach can protect in all aspects of the risk. And then organize the defense in depth. Masuk dalam lagi. And then lastly, measure program effectiveness. Develop security risk scorecard. Adakah berjaya? And then measure control effectiveness. Adakah berjaya mencapai the target? Fair factor analysis of information risk ataupun FAIR framework. It is a risk management framework to help organization understand, analyze, and measure information risk. The outcomes are more cost-effective information risk management, greater credibility, and a foundation from which to develop scientific approach to information risk management. The FAIR framework includes a taxonomy for information risk. Taxonomy is understanding. And then standard non-nomenclature for information risk terms. Okay, identify the operational terms for the risk. And then a framework for establishing data collection criteria, how you are going to collect the data. Macam dekat sini, gather the plan data, gather the risk data. Dekat FAIR pun sama juga. Measurement scales for risk factor, high impact, low impact, 1 to 7 scale, okay, Likert scale. A computational engine for calculating the risk, so they will calculate the risk for the organization. And then a modeling construct for analyzing complex risk scenario. Stage 1 in FAIR analysis, factor analysis ni, identify scenario components, whereby you need to identify which asset is at risk and identify the threat community under consideration. Stage 2, evaluate loss event frequency. Loss event frequency, the likelihood of an attack. Estimate the probable threat event frequency, estimate the threat capability, estimate the control strength, derive vulnerability, and then derive loss event frequency. Stage 3, evaluate probable loss magnitude. Estimate worst case loss and then estimate probable loss. Stage 4, derive and articulate a risk and formulate any risk. FAIR relies on the qualitative assessment of many risk components, which using scales with value range, for example, very high to very low. So the risk, kira loss event frequency, must consider the threat event frequency, the contact frequency, and then the action, vulnerability, the control strengths, and then how capable is the threat to cripple the system or cripple the whole organization. Probable loss magnitude, kira dia punya primary loss factor, the estimation of asset loss factors, and then asset threat loss factors. Secondary loss factors, organizational loss factors, and then external loss factors. And then another approach for risk treatment strategy, we use ISO 27000. It includes a 5-stage risk of management methodology. This one is standard lah. risk assessment, risk treatment, acceptance, communication, monitoring, and review. The process is number one, context establishment, and then after identify, estimate, and evaluation of the risk. If the decision point is satisfactory, yes, go for risk treatment. Sekiranya belum, perlu review lagi semula, the context establishment. If the risk decision point is satisfactory, the treatment is satisfactory, and then there will be residual risk. Therefore, the organization can opt for risk acceptance. Dan sama juga lah risk communication and process monitoring and review. ISO 31000 is another standard that addresses risk management, which was used in the formalization of the risk management methodology presented elsewhere in this text. ISO 31000 provides a structured methodology for evaluating threats to economic performance and organization. Kalau 27,000 tadi, how to manage the risk. This one, ISO 31000, how to evaluate threats in the economic performance of the organization. So this will look into the financial performance of the organization when the threat and vulnerability attack happen. ISO 31000 risk management framework process from the corporate governance dekat sini, mandate and commitment from the top management, design the framework for risk, implementing the risk. Okay, dekat sini clause 5 sama juga the process, tapi more on the financial performance of the organization. NIST Risk Management Framework, National Institute for Standards and Technology, fundamental approach to system management and certification accreditation to one that follows the industry standard of effective risk management. It follows a three-tiered approach. Okay, most organizations work from the top down, focusing first on the aspects that affect the entire organization, such as governance. Then after the more strategic issues are addressed, they move toward the tactical issues around the business process, that is the tier 2. The most detailed aspects are addressed in tier 3, dealing with information system. NIST Risk Management Framework Overview, assessing the risk within the context of organizational risk frame requires the identification of threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences of exploitation leading to losses and the likelihood of such losses. Okay, assess the risk, assess the threat vulnerabilities, assess, and then respond. And then monitor. Okay, frame ni ada 3 lah, assessment, response, and monitor. The tiered risk management approach, this one dari top governance pergi kepada The business process, barulah lihat kepada the information system. Dekat sini yang banyak specification, requirement perlu dinyatakan secara detail in order to have a complete risk management approach. Risk management strategy, architecture description, the business process, reference model, segment salutation, information system boundaries. This is more technical. And then organizational inputs, we have laws, directives from the top management, policy guidance, strategic goals, objectives, information security requirements, priority and resource availability. Okay, and then accountability will fall under this line, organizational inputs. Starting point, step 1, categorize the information system. Number 2, select the security controls. Number 3, implement the security controls. Number 4, assess the security controls. Number 5, authorize the information system. And then number 6, monitor the security controls. Repeat as necessary. Other methods, we use Mitre. Mitre is a non-profit organization designed to support research and development groups that have received federal funding. So Mitre presents a risk management plans that uses a 4-step approach. Number 1, risk identification. Number 2, risk impact assessment. Number 3, risk prioritization analysis. And number 4, risk mitigation planning. And then European Network and Information Security Agency provide utility on its website that help organization compare risk management methods and tools. And lastly, New Zealand's ISEC. It maintains ISO 27001 security website. Okay, it provides consultation on risk management and compliance approach. Selecting the best risk management models, most organizations already have a set of risk management practices in place. A recommended approach is to begin by studying the models presented here and by identifying what each offers to the envisioned process. Okay, if you ask me, I think Microsoft, the Microsoft risk management approach is more straightforward and mudah dipahami. Microsoft risk management approach. Okay, that's it for chapter 7, risk management, treating information security risk. Okay, thank you for listening.